This brings to mind the advice that neuroscientist Eric Kandel, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on the physiological basis of memory storage in neurons, took from his mentor, Harry Grunfest. When Kandel was a young man, Grunfest told him, "Look, if you want to understand the brain, you're going to have to take a reductionist approach, one cell at a time." Says Kandel, he was so right. Like many other bird cognition researchers, Lefebvre is now going neural, hoping to show how learning and problem-solving in birds is reflected in brain activity, in neurons, and in the junctions between them, known as synapses. One neuron communicates with another at these links between the two cells. I believe that whether an animal shows flexible, innovative behavior or not depends on events occurring here, at the synapses, says Lefebvre. What makes a bird smart and inventive like a Bajan bullfinch or a New Caledonian crow? Are black-faced grassquits and cagus really such simpletons? We're trying to come at these questions from different angles, says Lefebvre. You have to begin in the field, with your boots on the ground, and really look closely at the species in question. If you want to understand birds, you have to know how they behave in the wild, he says. Then you try to get inside their heads. So we're doing field observations of behaviors, comparing innovations per species, conducting experiments with captive birds, and now, looking for a way to connect what we see in the field with what we're learning about genes and cells in the lab. This is the sort of ambitious science going on everywhere in bird intelligence research. It's a remarkable blending of observation on ecology and behavior, cognitive studies in the lab, and deep-down probing of bird brains themselves aimed at solving the mysteries of the bird mind. The Bird Way. The Avian Brain Revisited. Once when I was cross-country skiing in the Adirondack Mountains, I stopped for lunch in a small clearing. The snow was thick on the ground and the cold was bone-chilling. The instant I pulled my peanut butter sandwich from its foil, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye and heard a familiar zee. A black-capped chickadee, a relative of that cream-skimming tit, had popped up on a branch at the edge of the clearing. Then another, and another. Soon there was a little herd of birds at my feet. When I held a crumb on my finger, one bird fluttered by and plucked it off. Then, moments later, the cheeky little thing perched right on my arm and ate directly from my hand. You might not tap the chickadee as the brightest bulb in birddom. It's known primarily for its cuteness. Round, fluffy little body in handsome gray coat and smart black cap. Short bill. Oversized head like E.T. It has nothing of the slender sleekness of warblers or vireos or the swaggering canny of the crow. It's mostly famous for its vim at the feeder and its astonishing acrobatics. As the ornithologist Edward Howe Forbush once observed, I have seen a chickadee drop over backward from a branch in pursuit of an insect, catch it, and turning an almost complete somersault in the air, strike right side up again on the leaning trunk of the tree. But the chickadee is more than just the bird of verve and agility. It's also acrobatic in its aptitudes, curious, intelligent, and opportunistic, with a remarkable memory, a bird masterpiece beyond all praise, in the words of Forbush. On Louis Lefebvre's IQ scale, the chickadee's family rates right up there with woodpeckers. Lately, the high, thin whistles and complex gargle calls of chickadees, the phoebes, z's, dds, and sibilant steeps, have been parsed by scientists and declared one of the most sophisticated and exacting systems of communication of any land animal. Chris Templeton and his colleagues have found that chickadees use their calls like language, complete with syntax that can generate an open-ended number of unique call types. They use some calls to convey their location to another bird or to twitter news of a tasty treat, others, to warn of predators, both the type of beast and the magnitude of its threat. A soft, high-pitched seat or sharp SASASI signals a threat on the wing, a shrike or a sharp-shinned hawk. The signature chickadee DD flags a stationary predator, a raptor perched in the treetops or an eastern screech owl looming on a limb above. The number of those skipping stone Ds indicates the predator's size and hence the degree of threat. More Ds means a smaller, more dangerous predator. This may seem counterintuitive, but small, agile predators that can maneuver easily are a greater menace than larger, more cumbersome ones. So a pygmy owl may elicit 4 Ds, while a great horned owl may garner only 2. These are calls for reinforcements, used to recruit other birds to harass or mob the menace in a group defense calibrated to the magnitude of the threat. So reliable are the chickadees' vocalizations that other species heed their warnings. Knowing this changes the way I hear those Ds as I walk through the woods. Maybe I'm being scrutinized as I pass, sized up and judged dangerous or not. Or maybe not. Maybe I'm summarily dismissed as a lumbering oaf, big but harmless. My presence causing barely a ripple in conversation. Chickadees are generally unfazed by people. Bold and inquisitive like bullfinches, they possess a deep-rooted self-confidence, and will investigate everything inside their home territory, Homo sapiens included. They'll hang around the cabins of hunters during hunting season to peck at the fat on the carcasses slung into truck beds. Often, they're the first to visit bird feeders and will even, as I learned, take food straight from the hand. Like bullfinches, they excel at discovering and exploiting new sources of food. Chris Templeton once watched a chickadee feed on nectar from a hanging hummingbird feeder. In winter they'll eat bees, roosting bats, tree sap, and dead fish. When gallflies were introduced to the American West in the 1970s to help control the spread of invasive spotted knapweed, chickadees seized the new opportunity. Templeton discovered that the birds quickly learned to spot the knapweed seed heads that harbored the highest densities of gallfly larvae, an unusually rich food. Whatever cues they used were subtle, captured on the wing, with little to no time spent hovering over the plants deciding. And yet almost invariably they found the seed heads with the major load. They would snatch their prizes in flight and carry them back to a tree to pluck out the larvae. Templeton was astounded. That chickadees are able to make such successful decisions with so little time spent assessing seed heads is remarkable, he notes. Equally impressive is how quickly the birds learn to exploit a completely novel food source, an exotic insect living on an introduced plant that had been present in its habitat for only a short time. Chickadees are also possessed of a prodigious memory. They stash seeds and other food in thousands of different hiding places to eat later and can remember where they put a single food item, for up to 6 months. All of this with a brain roughly twice the size of a garden pea. Not long ago I found a chickadee's skull in a patch of scruffy pines near my home. It nested neatly in my palm, chalky white and impossibly light, like the thinnest eggshell. It seemed little more than a bulbous eye case connected to a stitch of beak as sharp as a needle. At the back were twin domes, bubbles of translucent bone, where the brain had been. A chickadee weighs 11 or 12 grams, its brain, a mere 0.60 or 0.70 gram. How can such a diminutive brain be capable of such complex mental feats? Clearly there's more to a brain than mere size. But the truth is, birds have long had a bum rap in the size arena. Contrary to the cliché, the brains of many birds are actually considerably larger than expected for their body size. This is the result of an extraordinary process that also gave rise to our own oversized brains, although through a completely separate evolutionary path. Bird brains range in size from 0.13 gram for a Cuban emerald hummingbird to 46.19 grams for an emperor penguin. Tiny indeed next to the 7,800-gram brain of a sperm whale, but compared with animals of roughly the same size, not so small at all. The brain of a bantam bird weighs about 10 times as much as the brain of a similar-sized lizard. Consider a bird's brain relative to its body weight, and it comes out more like a mammal. Our brains weigh about 1,360 grams, or 3 pounds. For an average body weight of 140 pounds, wolves and sheep have about the same body weight as we do, but their brains are about 1/7 the size of ours. New Caledonian crows are like us, extravagant rule breakers. They possess a brain weighing 7.5 grams in a body that weighs only a little more than half a pound. That's the same size as the brain of a small monkey, like a marmoset or a tamarin, and 50% larger than the brain of a bush baby, all animals with roughly the same body size as the crow. And the brain of a chickadee? It has double the brain size of birds in the same body weight range, such as a flycatcher or a swallow. When you look at it this way, many bird species have surprisingly large brains for their body size. They're what scientists call hyperinflated, like our brains. For centuries, we thought birds' brains had been reduced in size for good reason, so the marsh hawk could float in wide circles, so the chimney swift could live a life entirely on the wing, so the chickadee could beat a change of course in less than 30 milliseconds. Brain tissue is heavy and metabolically expensive, the most expensive in the body, second only to the heart. Neurons may be small, but they're costly to make and maintain, consuming about 10 times more energy relative to their size than other cells. No wonder nature had trimmed a bird's gray matter, we thought. Ironically, the power of flight, which we regard as the bird's most magnificent attainment, has also been the evolutionary adaptation which has held it well behind the mammals in intelligence, Peter Matheson once wrote. Birds solved problems, we assumed, not by relying on their cleverness but by flying away from them. Flight is indeed an energy hog. In a bird the size of a pigeon, it consumes roughly 10 times as much energy as rest. For a small bird such as a finch, short flights that involve a lot of flapping expend almost 30 times as much energy. To meet the constraints of flight, nature has in fact considerably lightened a bird's load with a skeleton that blends strength and airiness. Some bones have been fused or eliminated. A light beak made largely of keratin has replaced a heavier, toothy jaw. Other bones, such as wing bones, are pneumatic, almost hollow but reinforced with strut-like trabeculae to keep them from buckling. A bird's bones are dense only where needed, even denser than the bones of their mammal counterparts, in the legs and in the deep solid breastbone that anchors the wings. When biologists examined the genes involved in a bird's skeletal system, they found that birds possess more than twice as many genes for bone remodeling and resorption than mammals do. Most bird bones are hollow and thin-walled, yet surprisingly stiff and strong. The paradoxical result sometimes boggles the mind. A frigate bird with a 7-foot wingspan has a skeleton that weighs less than its feathers. Evolution has found other ways to streamline or totally eliminate a bird's unnecessary body parts. Bladders have been done away with. The liver has dwindled to a mere half-gram. A bird's wild knot of a heart is 4-chambered and double-barreled like our own, but tiny, with a beat far more rapid. Its respiratory system is quite extraordinary, proportionately larger than in mammals, but much more efficient. Its flow-through lung, encased in a rigid trunk, maintains a constant volume and is connected to an intricate web of balloon-like sacs that store air outside the lungs. Unlike most of its reptilian relatives, birds have only one functional ovary, on the left side. The right one was lost over evolutionary time. Only in the breeding season is a bird burdened with heavy sex organs. For most of the year, testes, ovaries, and oviducts are vanishingly small. The condensed genomes of birds may also be an adaptation to powered flight. Birds have the smallest genomes of any amniote, the group of animals, including reptiles and mammals, that lay their eggs on land. A typical mammal has a genome ranging from 1 billion to 8 billion base pairs, whereas in birds, it hovers at around 1 billion, result of fewer repeat elements and a large number of so-called deletion events, in which DNA has been expunged over evolutionary time. A more compressed genome may allow a bird to regulate its genes more rapidly to meet the requirements of flight. All of this featherweight frugality is related to a remarkable evolutionary process begun in the dinosaur ancestors of birds. Thomas Huxley was among the first to see an evolutionary pathway from dinosaurs to modern birds, an observation, by the way, that did nothing to enhance public regard for bird smarts. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, the yellow-faced, square-jawed old man, with bright little brown eyes, as his student H.G. Wells called him, had only limited dinosaur fossil finds to draw from. But he saw bird-like traits in them and dinosaur-like traits in the recently discovered 150-million-year-old bird fossil Archaeopteryx. Indeed, Huxley wrote, if the whole hindquarters, from the ilium to the toes, of a half-hatched chicken could be suddenly enlarged, ossified, and fossilized as they are, they would furnish us with the last step of the transition between birds and reptiles. For there would be nothing in their characters to prevent us from referring them to the Dinosauria. Huxley was right, of course. Birds evolved from dinosaurs during the Jurassic period, 150 million to 160 million years ago. In fact, says paleontologist Stephen Bruzat of the University of Edinburgh, we find that there is no clear distinction between dinosaur and a bird. A dinosaur didn't just change into a bird one day. Instead, the bird body plan began early and was assembled gradually, piece by piece, over 100 million years of steady evolution. It's easy to catch the reptilian in birds. You can see it in their beady eyes and quick darting movements, in the pterodactyl-like wings of a rhinoceros hornbill, in a robin holding up his head in frozen alertness to catch a sound, his expressionless face remindful of a lizard's, or in a great blue heron, the slow heavy wing beat. The snaky finesse of its neck, the hoarse squawks, are all a throwback to dinosaur lagoons. But it baffles the imagination to think that the tiny flash-like chickadee could have arisen from the big beasts of vanished ages. In a remote corner of northeast China is a slash of land that tells the story of this remarkable transition. During the early Cretaceous, volcanic ash coated the region, creating the fossil-laced Jehol beds of Liaoning, Hebei, and Inner Mongolia. When I was at one fossil site near the tiny village of Sayatan in Liaoning province nearly 2 decades ago, the layer cake formations had been excavated only recently by villagers, and everywhere lay fossils of ancient fish, freshwater crustaceans, and mayfly larvae, imprinted on thin, brittle sheets of siltstone. I had come to chronicle a discovery made a year earlier by a farmer and amateur fossil collector probing the layers of the cliff formation. Embedded there was the fossil of a small creature in classic death pose, head thrown back and stiff tail sticking straight up. It looked like a large lizard, about a foot high and 2-legged. Running down its back, however, was something extraordinary, a fuzzy mane of simple hair-like filaments. The creature was a theropod dinosaur named Sinosauropteryx, Chinese dragon feather, a key link between birds and dinosaurs. I watched a photographer work with this little theropod fossil for 10 hours a day to erase the delicate impression of protofeathers locked in stone. It was astonishing to see the dark filamentous streaks emerge from the dinosaur's tail, primitive plumage. Modern birds. The ancient Jehol beds changed all that. In the past 2 decades, the beds have turned up a flood of fossil dinosaur specimens about 120 million to 130 million years old, with feathers of all types, from rudimentary fuzz and bristles to full-fledged flight feathers. One group of feathered dinosaurs common at the time, the paravs, were testing out flight modes, gliding, parachuting, jumping between trees, some vaulted into powered flight, and so birds were born. Dinosaurs gave rise to chickadees and herons in part through a process of relentless shrinking, a kind of Alice in Wonderland phenomenon known as sustained miniaturization. More than 200 million years ago, dinosaurs began rapidly diversifying in body size to fill new ecological niches. However, only the evolutionary line of dinosaurs leading to birds maintained these very high rates of change. Over a period of 50 million years, the theropod ancestors of birds continuously shrank in size. From 163 kilograms to less than 1 kilogram, nearly everything got small. Being little and light meant that these bird ancestors could explore new food niches and escape predators by climbing trees, gliding, and flying. They developed new adaptations significantly faster than did other dinosaurs. Their small size, evolutionary flexibility, and certain novel adaptations may have helped birds survive the catastrophic events that killed off many of their dinosaurian cousins, and then go on to become one of the most successful groups of land vertebrates on the planet. Did their brains shrink, too? Not so much. The dinosaurs that gave rise to birds possessed so-called hyperinflated brains even before the evolution of flight. The visual centers of their brains had already expanded to control the enlarged eyes and superior vision they used to avoid collisions, while jumping from tree to tree, as had the regions of the brain used to process sound and coordinate motion. The avian brain evolved to deal with the sophisticated level of neurological and muscular coordination required to explore new niches and escape predators. In other words, bird brains came before birds, just as feathers did. How does a creature hold on to a big brain while the rest of its body shrinks? Birds manage the trick the same way we did, by keeping a babyish head and face. It's an evolutionary process called pedomorphosis, whereby a creature evolves in such a way as to retain juvenile traits even after it matures. When an international group of scientists recently compared the skulls of birds, theropods, and crocodilians, they discovered that in most dinosaurs and crocodilians, the skull shape of the animal changed over a lifetime. During juvenile to adult growth in non-avian dinosaurs, their toothed snouts and faces expanded but their brains increased proportionally significantly less, explains Arkat Absanov of Harvard University, who worked on the study. Great examples of this are sauropods and stegosaurs with tiny brains relative to their large bodies. In both proto and modern birds, on the other hand, the skull maintained its youthful shape as the birds matured, leaving plenty of space for enormous eyes and enlarged brains. When we look at birds, says Absanov, we are looking at juvenile dinosaurs. As it happens, we humans may have pulled just such a Peter Pan-like move. As adults, we share the big head, flat face, small jaw, and patchy body hair of baby primates. Pedomorphosis may have enabled us to develop bigger brains, just as it did in birds. Not all birds have brains big for their body size. As with any group of animals, birds have their eggheads and their pinheads. Recall the comparison of birds of similar size, a crow and a partridge. Or two smaller birds, the great spotted woodpecker and. Reproductive strategy plays a role in brain size. The 20% of bird species that are precocial, born with their eyes open and able to leave the nest within a day or two, have larger brains at birth than altricial birds. The latter are born naked, blind, and helpless and remain in the nest until they're as big as their parents, and only then fully fledge. Precocial birds, such as shorebirds, typically take to life straight away. Though their brains are relatively large at hatching, allowing them to catch and eat an insect or run short distances when only days old, they don't grow much after birth, so they end up smaller than the brains of altricial birds. The same is true of brood parasites such as cuckoos, black-headed ducks, and honeyguides, birds that lay their eggs in the nests of others, sparing themselves the costs of rearing their own young. Their chicks, after chucking out their host's offspring or killing them, also leave the nest early with a brain that's big enough to allow them to fend for themselves, but without much later growth. Why do brood parasites have such small brains? Louis Lefebvre, who has studied brain size in honeyguides, suggests two possibilities. Maybe these birds need to outpace the developmental schedule of their host species, and as a result, they have evolved smaller brains. Or perhaps being a brood parasite relieves the brain of responsibility for all those things associated with raising your own young. We humans know how much energy it takes to raise a child, says Lefebvre. If we just dropped our babies into the nests of chimps, we would save ourselves a lot of information processing. The 80% of bird species that are altricial, such as chickadees, tits, crows, ravens, and jays, among others, may be born small-brained and helpless, but their brains, like ours, grow a great deal after birth, in part thanks to the nurturing of their parents. In other words, nest sitters end up with bigger brains than nest quitters. Brain size is also correlated with how long a bird stays in its nest to apprentice with its parents after fledging. The longer the juvenile period, the bigger the brain, perhaps so that a bird can store all it learns. Most intelligent animal species have long childhoods. One summer, I watched the leisurely upbringing of 5 great blue heron nestlings in a dead oak tree on a 10-acre pond in Sapsucker Woods, courtesy of a webcam installed by the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. In the past, I had caught quick sporadic glimpses of the nest life of robins, bluebirds, and wrens. But this new technology rent the veil, offering an almost embarrassingly intimate and lingering view of the great blue heron's awkward early childhood days. I've always loved these herons, wide-winged and wonderful in their slow sailing. But I never imagined the joy and wonder of seeing them grow up close. Like 500,000 other voyeurs from 166 countries, I became a heron addict. Our chat room was a close-knit virtual community under the careful supervision of a bird room monitor. Classrooms of children tuned in every morning. Someone with an unspecified pain condition tweeted that observing the herons kept her from going crazy. Together we watched the chicks hatch in late April, then, sleepy and helpless, snuggle under parental down to weather rainstorms and owl attacks, gobble up regurgitated fish and fall into a stupor after eating, peck at everything, sticks, camera, bugs, their parents' bills. One another, all necessary practice for the accurate and powerful spearing of fish. Considerable consternation arose in our virtual community with the hatching of the 5th and last chick, smaller than the number 5 getting nothing. Worrying. Then the monitor. Why do people always want to make up stories that project tragic fates on number 5 when he is doing just fine? Where there is no drama, people create it. We can't help ourselves. Number 5 reminds me of the neighbor boy in Death of a Salesman. In Act 1, he's this nerdy little dweeb, and in Act 2, he's a successful attorney arguing cases before the Supreme Court. At night, I watched the herons sleep. Some birds can go without sleep for long periods. Pectoral sandpipers, for instance, forego sleep for weeks in favor of constant activity under the perpetual light of the Arctic summer. But most species, including herons, seem to share our need for regular sleep. And their sleep, like ours, appears critical to their developing brains. Birds experience the same cycles of slow-wave sleep and rapid eye movement sleep that humans do, patterns of brain activity that scientists believe play a crucial role in the growth of big brains, theirs and ours. Birds rarely have REM sleep longer than 10 seconds, packaged into hundreds of episodes per sleep period, while humans have several bouts of REM sleep per night, each lasting 10 minutes to an hour. But for both mammals and birds, REM sleep may be especially important for the early development of the brain. Newborn mammals such as kittens have much more REM sleep than adult cats. Human babies may spend up to half their sleep in the REM stage, whereas for adults, it's about 20% likewise. Studies show that young owlets have more REM sleep than older owlets. Perhaps those heron chicks did, too. Like us, birds also have periods of deep, slow-wave sleep in direct proportion to how long they've been awake. Moreover, in both birds and humans, the brain regions used more extensively in waking hours sleep more deeply during subsequent sleep, another similarity born of convergent evolution. A team of international researchers headed by Niels Rattenborg at the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology recently discovered this convergence in a clever study that made use of birds' ability to do something we can't do, modulate their deep sleep by opening one eye, limiting the slow-wave sleep to only one half of the brain while keeping the other half alert, perhaps to navigate while they sleep on the wing, and certainly to watch for predators. The team rigged up a little movie theater for several pigeons, blocked one eye in each of them, and showed them David Attenborough's The Life of Birds. After staying awake watching the film for 8 hours with a single eye, the birds were allowed to sleep. Studies of their brain activity showed deeper slow-wave sleep in the visual processing region of the brain connected to the stimulated eye. That both humans and birds show this kind of localized brain effect suggests that slow-wave sleep may play a role in maintaining optimal brain functioning, says Rattenborg. Overall, the parallels between mammalian and avian sleep raise the intriguing possibility that their independent evolution may be related to the function served by this pattern of sleep, the evolution of large, complex brains in both birds and mammals. I love this idea that nature dreamed up the same kind of sleep in both humans and birds, fostering the growth of big brains in creatures so far apart on life's tree. Tuning in each morning to the waking herons was like reading the next chapter in a great coming-of-age novel. In the fledgling phase of May and June, the chicks took clumsy nest-walking laps while mom and dad hustled to feed their rapidly growing bodies, which shot up from 2.5 ounces at hatching to 5 pounds in only 7 weeks. Like a baby in a backpack, the young birds took to watchful tracking of everything that moved, airplanes, geese, bees, their parents stalking the pond and gauging their strike angle. Then there was fledging, the first hopfly, the first plunge over the edge of the nest. Later, the first stabs at plundering the shallows, often unsuccessful, the dogged persistence nonetheless, the return to the nest by nightfall. All under the watchful eye of their parents, who welcomed them back into the nest and offered supplemental frogs and fish. Contrast this way of life with the precocial plover, which, after erupting from the egg, is up and running, quite literally, almost as soon as its feathers are dry. It's a trade-off, full functionality at birth versus greater brain power later. Migration is another trade-off. Birds that migrate have smaller brains than their sedentary relatives. This makes sense, as a brain that consumes a lot of energy and develops slowly would be too costly for birds that travel a lot. Moreover, according to Daniel Soul of the Center for Research on Ecology and Forestry Applications in Spain, innate, hardwired behavior may be more useful to migratory species that move between vastly different habitats than learned, Innovative behavior. It may not pay to spend a lot of mental resources gathering information in one place that may not be useful in another. Here's a surprise: even within a species, brain size may vary, or at least the size of certain brain parts. Vladimir Pravosudov of the University of Nevada and his team compared 10 different populations of black-capped chickadees, and found that those living in the harsher climates of Alaska, Minnesota, and Maine have a larger hippocampus, the brain region vital for spatial learning and memory, with more neurons than their counterparts from Iowa or Kansas. The same goes for mountain chickadees, the tough little cousins of the black-capped, who frequent mountains in the West. Mountain chickadees that live in the colder, snowier conditions of higher elevations have bigger hippocampi than their lower elevation peers. Those from the highest peaks in the Sierra Nevada, for instance, have almost twice the number of hippocampal neurons than their peers living only 650 yards lower down. This makes sense. At higher elevations, where it stays cold longer, birds must store more seeds and remember where they put them. Recovering caches is not so critical in milder climates, where food is available year-round. Whatever the size, something remarkable happens in the hippocampus of these scatter-hoarding birds on a routine basis. New neurons are born, adding to, or replacing, the old ones. The reason for this neurogenesis remains a mystery. It may allow the brain to recruit new neurons when it's required to learn new information, or it may help to prevent a new memory from interfering with an old one. As Pravosudov points out, chickadees cache food, retrieve caches, and recake previous food caches on a daily basis, especially in winter, so they need to keep track of the old and new caches. The interference avoidance idea suggests that birds may need to separate the events by using different neurons for different memories. Pravosudov has shown that chickadees from populations experiencing difficult climatic conditions, and therefore compelled to cache more, have higher rates of neurogenesis. In any case, this changeover of neurons has forever altered how we think of vertebrate brains, including our own. We are not born with all the brain cells we will ever have, as scientists long believed. In the hippocampus of humans, too, new brain cells are born and others die. We now understand that this ability to change and renew neurons and the connections between them provides the brain with the potential to modify itself, to learn, at timescales ranging from milliseconds to minutes to weeks, says Pravosudov. In food-caching birds like the chickadee, this plasticity may allow the birds to meet the mental requirements of a demanding world within relatively limited brain space. The conventional notion that a bigger brain is always better and more powerful in vertebrates such as birds and mammals was finally put to rest with a simple but ingenious new way of measuring brain power: counting neurons. In 2014, Brazilian neuroscientist Susana Herculano Hausel and her colleagues determined the numbers of neurons and other cells in the brains of 11 species of parrots and 14 species of songbirds. The brains of birds may be small, says Herculano Hausel, but they pack surprisingly high numbers of neurons, really high, with densities at least akin to what we find in primates. And in corvids and parrots, the numbers are even higher. Much depends on where the neurons are. Herculano Hausel has shown that elephant brains have 3 times the number of neurons found in the human brain. But 98% of them are in the elephant cerebellum, she says, where they may be involved in control of the trunk, a 200-pound appendage with fine sensory and motor capabilities. An elephant's cerebral cortex, on the other hand, which is twice as big as ours, has only a third the number of neurons found in our cerebral cortex. To Herculano Hausel, this suggests that what determines cognitive abilities is not the number of neurons in the whole brain but in the cerebral cortex, or its equivalent in birds. In a macaw, for instance, Herculano Hausel and her team found that nearly 80% of the brain neurons are contained within the cortex-like part of the brain, while only 20% reside in the cerebellum. This is the opposite of the ratio found in most mammals. In short, finding large numbers of neurons in the cortex-like structures of parrots and songbirds, especially corvids, suggests a large computational capacity, say the scientists, which in turn may explain the behavioral and cognitive complexity reported for these bird families. Size is not the only reason bird brains have long had a bad rap, anatomy is another. What little brain a bird had was considered primitive, barely more sophisticated than a reptile's. Birds were viewed as lovely automata capable only of stereotyped activity, says Harvey Carton, a neuroscientist at the University of California, San Diego, who has studied the avian brain for the past half-century. This anatomical dissing began in the late years of the 19th century, with the observations of Ludwig Edinger, a German neurobiologist known as the father of comparative anatomy. Edinger believed that evolution was linear and progressive. Like Aristotle, he ranked creatures in a ladder-like scala naturae, from lower, less evolved fish and reptiles to higher, more advanced animals, with humans, of course, crowning the top. Each species going up the steps of the ladder was an elaboration of an older species. In his view, brains evolved in the same step-stool fashion, moving from primitive brain to more complex brain by adding new parts on top of old parts. The more intelligent new brain regions of higher animals were layered over the less intelligent old ones of lower animals like geological strata, progressing in size and complexity from fish and amphibians, with the most primitive brains, to that pinnacle of evolution, the human cerebrum. The old, or bottom, brain contained neurons arranged in clusters and was the seat of instinctive behaviors, such as feeding, sex, parenting, and motor coordination. The new, or top, brain consisted of 6 flat layers of cells enveloping the old brain. It was the seat of higher intelligence. In humans it had grown so vast, it had to buckle and fold to fit inside our skulls. The new layered top brain was the seat of higher thinking. In Edinger's view, birds simply lacked the hardware necessary for complex behavior. Instead of a layered and folded atopy brain, they had essentially smooth bottom brain structures, composed almost entirely of those old reptilian low-life clusters of neurons. Hence they were primarily creatures of instinct, of hardwired, reflexive behavior, and incapable of high-level intellectual feats. The names Edinger gave to structures reflected his misguided beliefs. He used the prefixes paleo and archa to label structures in the bird brain and neo for parts of the mammalian brain. The old bird brain was called the paleoencephalon. The new mammal's brain was the neoencephalon. This terminology, which implied that the bird brain was more primitive than a mammal's brain, severely underplayed the mental abilities of birds. Words will do that. We are a naming species, and what we call things influences the way we think about them and the experiments we deem worthy of doing. Calling regions of the bird brain paleostriatum primitivum reinforced notions of primordial dimness and stifled interest in studies on bird learning and brain power. Thus, the syllogism went like this. The neocortex is the special seat of intelligence. Birds have no neocortex. Therefore, birds have little or no intelligence. Edinger's view held for more than a century, into the 1990s. But beginning in the late 1960s, scientists such as Harvey Carton began to look deeper into bird and mammal brains. Carton and his colleagues peered closely at the cells, cell circuits, molecules, and genes of different animal brains and compared them. They examined embryonic development to see which regions of the brain gave rise to others. They traced the wiring of neurons to understand how they linked different brain regions. What they found turned Edinger's old notions on their heads. Bird brains are not primitive, undeveloped versions of mammalian brains. Birds have been evolving separately from mammals for more than 300 million years, so it's hardly surprising that their brains look quite different. But they do in fact have their own elaborate cortex-like neural system for complex behavior. In ornithological parlance, it's called the dorsal ventricular ridge, or DVR. It arises from the same region of the embryonic brain during development as a mammal's cortex does, the so-called pallium, and then matures into a dramatically different architectural form. At the same time, lab experiments began to show evidence of complex behavior in birds. A pigeon's exceptional ability to discriminate between pictures that showed humans and those that did not, for instance, whether the humans were clothed or naked. The African gray parrot's talent for toting up numbers and categorizing objects, and the expertise of certain corvids for remembering the location of other birds' food caches. But despite all these breakthroughs, the bias against bird brains held on, in part because of Edinger's ill-conceived labeling of brain regions. Finally, in 2004 and 2005 came a manifesto rescuing the anatomical reputation of the bird brain. An international group of 29 experts in neuroanatomy, led by two neurobiologists, Eric Jarvis of Duke University and Anton Reiner of the University of Tennessee, issued a series of papers overhauling Ittinger's misguided views and antiquated alphabet soup of brain misnomers. The members of the Avian Brain Nomenclature Consortium not only renamed the parts of the bird brain in light of modern understanding, they also related its structures to parallel structures in the mammalian brain so that bird biologists could talk to mammal biologists about what, in fact, were very similar brain regions in their respective subjects. About 75% of our forebrain is cortex, says Jarvis, and the same is true for birds, particularly species of songbirds and parrots. They have as much cortex, relatively speaking, as we do. It's just not organized the way ours is. Whereas the nerve cells in a mammal's neocortex are stacked in 6 distinct layers, like plywood, those in the bird's cortex-like structure cluster like cloves in a garlic bulb. But the cells themselves are basically the same, capable of rapid and repetitive firing, and the way they function is equally sophisticated, flexible, and inventive. Moreover, they use the same chemical neurotransmitters to signal between them. And perhaps most important, bird and mammal brains share similar nerve circuits, or pathways, between brain regions, which turns out to be vital for complex behavior. It's the connections, the links between brain cells, that matter in the matter of intelligence. And in this regard, bird brains are not so different from our own. Irene Pepperberg uses a computer analogy. Mammalian brains are like PCs, she says, while bird brains are like apples. The processing is different, but the output is similar. The point, says Eric Jarvis, is that there is more than one way to generate complex behaviors. There's the mammal way. And there's the bird way. Consider the workings of working memory, one of the cognitive abilities that the New Caledonian crow named 007 revealed in that 8-stage puzzle of sticks, stones, and boxes. Working memory, also called scratchpad memory, is the capacity to remember facts for a short time while addressing a problem. It's what allows us to remember a phone number while we dial it. And it's what allowed 007 to keep in mind his goal while completing the many steps required to achieve it. Both birds and humans appear to use working memory in a similar way. In our brains, the process that generates it arises in the layered cerebral cortex. But birds have no layered cortex, so how is information in the crow brain stored from moment to moment? To find out, Andreas Nieder and a team of researchers at the Institute for Neurobiology at the University of Tübingen taught for carrion crows to play a version of pairs, the game of memory that involves holding an image in mind while searching for its match. They showed the crows a random image. The birds then had to remember this image for a second before selecting the match out of 4 options, by tapping the recalled picture with their beaks. Correct answers were rewarded with a mealworm or birdseed pellet. As the crows performed the task, the scientists observed the electrical activity in their brains. The crows were pros, accomplishing the matching task easily and proficiently. What was happening inside their brains? In what's called the nidopallium caudolateral region, an area analogous to the prefrontal cortex in a primate, a cluster of up to 200 cells that were activated when the birds saw the original image remained activated, while they searched for a match. This is the same mechanism that allows humans to hold in mind relevant information while we carry out a task. Clearly, working memory can exist without a layered cerebral cortex. In humans and birds, it differ only with respect to the presence of a language component in humans, says Onur Gunderkin, a neuroscientist at the Ruhr University Bochum in Germany. The neural processes generating working memory seem to be identical in both. Birds have finally gained new respect. They may be relatively small-brained, but they are certainly not small-minded. So maybe the question now is not, are birds smart, but why are they smart? Especially given the constraints of flight on brain size. What evolutionary forces have been at play in shaping bird intelligence? Theories abound, but 2 predominate. One claims that ecological problems, especially related to foraging, helped to drive the expansion of bird brains and boosted cognitive abilities. How do I find enough food throughout the year with the challenge of harsh seasons? How do I remember where I hid my seeds? How do I get at hard-to-get foods? In general, animals facing unforgiving or unpredictable environments are thought to have enhanced cognitive abilities, including better problem-solving skills and an openness to exploring new things. The other theory suggests that social pressures have propelled the evolution of a flexible, intelligent mind, getting along with others, claiming and defending territory, dealing with pilferers and thieves, finding a mate, caring for offspring, sharing responsibilities. Another idea, first suggested by Darwin, hints that an animal's cognitive abilities are as much a product of sexual selection as natural selection. Do choosy female birds shape the intelligence of their species? The answers aren't all in, but crows and jaybirds, mockingbirds and finches, pigeons and sparrows, are providing some tantalizing clues. Boffins. Technical wizardry. A bird named Blue has a problem. Next to him on a table in his aviary is a plastic tube with a piece of meat tucked inside, just out of reach of his beak. Like 007, Blue is a New Caledonian crow, a bird known for its masterful tool craftsmanship and keen problem-solving skills. Blue scopes out the situation, hopping around the tube, peering inside, moving his head with click-stop precision. He flutters down to the floor of the aviary and pecks around at various random objects scattered there, leaves, tiny twigs, a stray piece of plastic or two, but apparently doesn't find what he's looking for. He flies to a scrubby spray of branches clustered in a pot on the table and perches, cocking his head to the right and then the left, surveying his options. He picks a twig and snaps it off the bough. Then he methodically snips off all the side twiglets. Now he has a nice long, straight stick. The right tool for the job. He jabs the stick into the tube and spears the meat, then polishes it off. Watching Blue neatly fashion a perfect little tool from scrubby branches is a wonder. In the wild, these crows make elaborate tools from sticks, leaf edges, and other materials, which they use to winkle grubs and insects from burrows in fallen wood, from behind bark or leaves, and from the base of leaves, crevices, holes, and cavities of all kinds. The crows travel with their tools, suggesting they value them. They know a good tool when they see one and keep it for reuse. There's something almost outlandish about this behavior. Birds making a tool so good they want to reuse it? Plenty of animals use tools, but few make such elaborate ones. In fact, as far as we know, only 4 groups of animals on the planet craft their own complex tools: humans, chimps, orangutans, and New Caledonian crows. And even fewer make tools they keep and reuse. This scene with Blue is a little window on a big idea. Birds are smart because they have to solve problems in their environment, specifically, problems of how to get food from hard-to-get places. It's called the technical intelligence hypothesis. Ecological challenges have provided an evolutionary stimulus to intelligence in birds. In British slang, boffin is a term for a kind of technological geek, someone with extensive skill in a specialized field. The New Caledonian crow fits the bill. Its use of tools is unmatched in the bird world. And its ability to craft its own tools is on par with such primate smarties as chimpanzees and orangutans. Why does it matter? What's the big deal about tools? We once considered the ability to make and use tools to be a sign of high intelligence or complex cognition, uniquely human, like language or consciousness. The use of tools, we thought, required some distinctively human understanding, including causal reasoning, a grasp of cause and effect. It was one thing that singled us out as special and played a pivotal role in our evolution and development as a species. Benjamin Franklin called us Homo faber, man the toolmaker. A list of the tools we have invented is a useful proxy for the entire history of our species. According to Alex Taylor and Russell Gray of the University of Auckland, stone axes, fire, clothes, pottery, the wheel, paper, concrete, gunpowder, the printing press, the automobile, the nuclear bomb. The internet, the manufacture of these tools created revolutions in the societies they were invented in, as each of them either redefined how humans interacted with either the environment or with each other. The notion of tool use as uniquely human went by the wayside when Jane Goodall discovered that the chimpanzees of Gom National Park also use tools. So do orangutans, macaques, and elephants, it turns out, and even insects. A female digger wasp will hold a pebble in her mandibles and use it to hammer shut the soil and pebbles sealing her burrow. Weaver ants harness their own larvae as tools in building and repairing their sturdy nests. The worker ants pick up the larvae, which secrete silk, and shuttle them back and forth so the silk cements together the leaves in their nests. Still, tool use is exceedingly rare in the animal world, documented in less than 1% of species. For a long time, primates were considered the primo tool users. But in the past decade or so, New Caledonian crows have emerged as contenders for that title. This is no small achievement, especially when you look at the catalog of, say, orangutan tools, which range from toothpicks and teeth cleaners to autoerotic tools and missiles aimed at predators. From leaf napkins and moss sponges to leafy branch fans and scoops, chisels, hooks, nail cleaners, and bee covers, branches or leaves used as a hat to protect against stinging bees. Or a chimp's clever constructions, a rake made by combining as many as 3 sticks or bamboo poles to reach a reward, or a kind of plate assembled from leaves and then reassembled to form a drinking cup. Even in this shrewd company, New Caledonian crows stand out. While they may not make and use the variety of tools that chimps and orangutans do, they craft their tools with precision from a range of materials. They make them the proper length and diameter for any particular task. They modify them to solve new problems. They innovate. They use tools in sequence, as 007 did in the video of that 8-stage puzzle, using a short tool to get a longer one that can be used to get food. And perhaps most impressively, they make and use hooked tools, the only species other than humans to do so. The first time I saw a New Caledonian crow use a tool in the wild was along a road that climbs steeply between Focolo and Ferino, in southern New Caledonia. At an overlook along the road, the government had recently erected an elaborate wooden guardrail. The spot pulls tourists from the highway to gawk at the stunning views of forested mountains and the blue waters of Moindu Bay. But that April morning, the spot was more popular with winged visitors. Alex Taylor has taken me there in the hopes of catching the crows nut cracking during their morning feeding. The birds have a fairly strict daily rhythm, not unlike our own 8-hour day. They're active from dawn through late morning. Depending on the heat, then they take their version of a siesta until early afternoon, when they get active again until dusk. Right now, they're in business-like food-gathering mode, explains Taylor. It's a small window in the day when they're willing to put themselves in danger. Sure enough, 4 or 5 families of New Caledonian crows are rustling around in the shrubs below the road, flitting from branch to branch, quietly whack-whack-ang on the ground. Someone has dumped a load of garbage over the edge of the road, and the birds are sorting through the offal. New Caledonian crows, like rats and humans, are euryphagous, partial to a variety of plant and animal food. They will happily consume insects and their larvae, snails, lizards, carrion, fruit, nuts, and human leftovers littering a site. The pickings here are easy, and it seems unlikely that the crows will bother with anything as demanding as nut cracking. The nuts they feed on belong to the candlenut tree, the same tree that harbors the juicy beetle larvae the crows extract with their tools, and they're not easy to open. But suddenly we hear a sharp crack on the pavement behind us. We turn around and notice several crows in the trees above the road. One perches on a forked branch overhanging the pavement, releases a nut, which breaks with a thwack, and then swoops down to collect the nut meat from the broken shell. Not only do New Caledonian crows crack nuts in this way, but the more gourmand among them have also been known to split escargots by this method, tossing the rare endemic snail Placostylus fibratus onto the rocky beds of dry creeks in the rainforest to get at their tasty insides. Many birds open nuts, shellfish, and eggs in similar fashion. The vampire finch of the Galapagos Islands breaks apart the large eggs of boobies by bracing its beak on the ground and booting the egg with both feet to crack it against rocks or roll it over a cliff. The black-breasted buzzard of Australia unloads stones on emu nests, and the Egyptian vulture releases them onto ostrich eggs. Carrion crows use passing cars to crush especially tough nuts, such as walnuts, that won't break by simply falling on pavement. The now famous video of these crows in a city in Japan shows one stationed above a pedestrian crossing. When the light turns red, it positions its nut on the crossing, then flies back to the perch and waits while the light changes and traffic passes. When the light turns red again, it flutters down to safely collect the cracked nut. If no car smashed the nut, the bird repositions it. Strictly speaking, dropping food on hard surfaces isn't tool use. But the New Caledonian crows here have added a twist. Down the road from us, a crow lands on that newly built wooden barrier. He drops his nut into a big round hole in the wood that houses a large metal bolt. He lodges the nut there, then uses the bolt as an anvil to hold it firmly while he pries open the cracked nut with his beak. Ingenious. Other birds use tools they find lying around. A wanderer in the pages of ornithological journals and Robert Shoemaker's fascinating compendium on animal tool behavior discovers delightful and surprising accounts of birds using found objects as tools to contain water or scratch their backs or wipe themselves down or lure prey. For instance, a white stork bringing water to its chicks in a clump of damp moss and then wringing it out to fill their beaks. African gray parrots bailing water from their dish with a tobacco pipe or a bottle cap. An American crow ferrying water in a frisbee to dampen its dried mash. And one securing a plastic slinky toy onto its perch and using the free end to scratch its head. A Gila woodpecker fashioning a wooden scoop out of tree bark to carry honey home to its young. A blue jay using its own body as a napkin to rid ants of their noxious formic acid spray, making them fit for eating. Some birds use objects as weapons. One American crow in Stillwater, Oklahoma, lobbed 3 pine cones at a scientist's head as he climbed up to its nest. A pair of ravens in Oregon defending their nestlings from 2 intruding researchers used similar tactics but harder weaponry. A rock the size of a golf ball fell past my face and landed next to my feet, wrote one of the scientists. The researchers assumed that a raven perched on a cliff above the nest had accidentally kicked loose the stone. But then they saw a raven with a rock in its beak. With a quick flip of its head, the raven tossed the rock down toward its target. Then 6 more, one after another. A rock that struck a researcher on the leg had marks indicating that the raven had pulled it out of the ground, where it had been partially buried. Several kinds of birds use objects as lures to draw fish. Greenbacked herons are expert bait fishers, known to entice their prey with bread, popcorn, seeds, flowers, live insects, spiders, feathers, even pellets of fish food. Dung is the decoy of choice for the burrowing owl. The owls scatter clumps of animal feces near the mouth of their nest chambers and wait motionless like muggers for unsuspecting dung beetles to scuttle toward their trap. Nuthatches hold bark flakes or scales in their bills to lever the bark from trees, exposing the bugs beneath. One chestnut-backed chickadee was seen using a thorn to pry seeds from a suet feeder. Other notable bird uses of sticks, twigs, and branches, as drumsticks by black palm cockatoos, which regularly use them in the wild to thrum a hollow tree trunk for territorial display, or to direct a female's attention to a possible breeding hole, as back scratchers, as well as head, neck, and throat scratchers, by yellow-crested cockatoos and African gray parrots. As a club by a bald eagle seen bludgeoning a turtle with a stick held in its bill, and, perhaps most unusual, as a kind of bayonet in a scuffle over seed between a crow and a jay. This last example is the first documented case of a bird using an object as a weapon against another bird, so it's worth pausing to explain. Early one April morning not long ago, ornithologist Russell Balda was watching an American crow leisurely feeding at a platform in Flagstaff, Arizona, that was stocked daily with a variety of seeds for local birds. Steller's jays visited the site often to take advantage of the easy fare, flying off with the seeds to cache them nearby. One jay, apparently unhappy with the crow's unhurried pace of dining that morning, tried to dislodge the bigger bird by scolding and dive-bombing it, but to no avail. The jay then flew into a nearby tree and vigorously worked with its bill to break off a twig from a dead branch. It succeeded and, taking the blunt end in its beak with the sharp end pointing outward, flew back down to the platform. Brandishing the twig like a lance or spear, it lunged at the crow, missing its body by an inch. When the crow lunged back, the jay dropped the twig. The crow picked it up, pointed end outward, and stabbed back at the jay. The jay flew off, with the crow in hot pursuit, twig still in bill. These are mostly examples of sporadic tool use. Among the handful of birds other than New Caledonian crows that make a regular habit of using tools are the woodpecker finches of the Galapagos Islands. One of the many finches Darwin found in the Galapagos, each with a beak shape optimized for the most abundant food source on the islands it occupies, the small, buff-breasted woodpecker finch has a powerful pick-like bill that it uses to chip away at bark and old wood to uncover grubs and beetles. Splints of wood fly off during the work, and the birds use these to probe tree holes or crevices beyond the reach of their beaks. They also use twigs, leaf petioles, and cactus spines to pull arthropods from otherwise inaccessible nooks and crannies. Sabine Tebich, a behavioral biologist at the University of Vienna who has studied these birds for more than 15 years, has found that only those finches living in dry, unpredictable habitats, where food is scarce and hard to access, use tools, and will spend half their foraging hours doing so. Woodpecker finches that live in more humid areas, where food is more abundant and easy to obtain, on the other hand, rarely use tools. In the first experimental study of how birds may acquire their use of tools, Tebich found that woodpecker finches are born with the ability and don't need an adult tutor to refine their skills, but they do grow more skillful over time through trial and error learning. One bird Tebich acquired for her study offered a close look at its gradual mastery of tool skills. Tebich found a wish in a domed nest of mosses and grasses tucked into the branches of a giant scalesia tree on Santa Cruz Island. The chick was only a few days old and crippled from attack by fly larvae. Over the next several months, a small army of scientists at the Charles Darwin Research Station cared for him. 2 of them documented his progress in a charming account. At first the finch showed little interest in objects. But when he was almost 2 months old, he began to play with flower stems and small twigs, twiddling them in his beak and holding them at right angles to his bill. Soon he was investigating everything around him with great curiosity, tweaking buttons, nibbling pencils, yanking hair. Through the small ventilation holes in a slouch hat, prying apart toes with his beak and tools, inspecting ears and earrings. By 3 months, he was an accomplished tool user and had broadened his toolkit, probing cracks with twigs, a feather, fragments of water-worn glass, wood slivers, shell pieces, and the hind leg of a large green grasshopper. He also inserted a twig between a sock and a boot. It seemed to wish that any potential crack was worth trying to open, wrote the scientists. Even a person's face was not sacrosanct. He would fly to the face and clutch hold on the nose arch. He would then hang upside down and peer into the nostrils. If the face possessed a beard, he would sometimes land on the hair, as if on a mossy trunk. From this vantage point, he thrust his bill between the lips and forced them apart. If the mouth opened, he then examined the teeth with the tip of the beak. Recently Tebich and her colleagues observed 2 woodpecker finches in the wild, an adult and a juvenile, doing something new. The birds found a novel kind of tool and modified it for better effect. The adult bird tweaked several barbed twigs from blackberry bushes and removed the leaves and side twigs. It oriented the tool so the barbs were facing in the right direction to effectively drag its prey, arthropods, from under the bark of a scalesia tree. The juvenile bird watched the adult using the tool and then used it himself in the same way. One gets the feeling that other birds out there may be better boffins than we think, we just haven't caught them in the act. Take Goffin's cockatoos, small white cockatoos with a bishop's hat crest, known to be curious and playful and, in captivity, exceedingly adept at picking locks. No one has observed these birds using tools in their natural tropical dry forest habitat on the Tanimbar archipelago of Indonesia. But Alice Auersperg and her team at the University of Vienna watched a captive cockatoo named Figaro spontaneously tear long splinters from the wooden beams of his cage with his beak. He then used a splinter to rake in a nut just out of reach. In later experiments, Figaro fashioned a new tool for every nut placed out of reach, successfully, reliably, and repeatedly, making and modifying stick-type tools using different materials and techniques to accomplish the task. Still, as far as we know, in terms of artful toolmaking and use in the wild, no bird matches the New Caledonian crow. A few years ago, Christian Rutz of the University of St. Andrews and his team used motion-triggered video cameras to get detailed views of the crows using tools at 7 sites in the wild. Over a period of about 4 months, They recorded more than 300 site visits and 150 instances of crows using tools to extract larvae from wood. The dexterity of the crows is astonishing. A crow fishing for larvae looks a lot like the termite fishing Jane Goodall observed in the chimpanzees of Gom. The crows repeatedly poke the larvae with their tool until the creature chomps down on the tip with its powerful mandibles. By carefully wiggling the tool, flicking gently right and left, twisting it ever so slightly, the bird brings a grub to the surface and carefully withdraws the tool without losing its prey. It may sound easy, but it's not, even for us humans with our nimble digits. Rutz and his colleagues tried their own hands at the task and found that it requires remarkable levels of sensoromotor control, and is surprisingly difficult to master. When it comes to the nuts and bolts of tool crafting, only chimps and orangutans match or exceed the New Caledonian crow's sophistication. And not even these hotshot primates can make hooked tools. As if that were not enough, the crows make not one but two kinds of hooked tools, one from live twigs and the other from the barbed edges of the leaves of pandanus trees, or screw pines. The twig hook tool involves snipping one side off a forked twig and breaking off the remaining side just below the base of the fork, then removing all the side twiglets. From the short stump that remains, the crow sculpts a little hook, sharpening the point until it's perfectly suited to fishing out small prey. The pandanus tools are made from the spiny strap-shaped leaves that crown the pandanus tree. They come in 3 designs: wide, narrow, and stepped. The stepped version is the most sophisticated, says Alex Taylor. It's wide and sturdy at the top, easy to grip, and steps down to a thin and flexible probing end. It takes many complex moves conducted in a very precise manner to complete the tool, snipping at one spot and tearing along that edge, then snipping at another spot and tearing from there, several times in a row. The final version looks a lot like a miniature saw but is used as a probe to wheedle out grasshoppers, crickets, cockroaches, slugs, spiders, and other invertebrates from otherwise inaccessible nooks and crannies. One remarkable feature of these implements, unlike tools made by other animals, such as the brush-tip tools of chimpanzees, created in sequential steps, the complete shape and design of a pandanus step tool is determined before it's made. The bird crafts the whole thing while it's still on the leaf. It works as a tool only after the crow makes a final cut to separate it from the leaf. This suggests to some scientists that the bird may be working from some form of mental template. And another cool thing, once the tool is removed from the leaf, an exact negative impression of its shape remains on the leaf, a counterpart. In an island-wide survey, Gavin Hunt and Russell Gray of the University of Auckland studied the shapes of more than 5,000 counterparts at dozens of sites across New Caledonia. They found that the styles of toolmaking varied from place to place, and those styles seem to have persisted for decades. In some parts of the island, the crows make wide tools primarily. In others, more narrow tools. The step tool design is the one that's the most widespread over the island. On the island of Mare, just adjacent to New Caledonia, says Hunt, the crows make only wide tools. In other words, it seems there may be local styles or traditions of toolmaking that are passed down over generations. Faithful transmission of local tool designs, if it's true, that fairly well defines the term culture. Moreover, in Hunt's view, there's evidence that the crows have made incremental improvements in their tool designs over time, which would make them the only non-primate species known thus far to demonstrate cumulative technological change. At most sites in New Caledonia, the crows make only the stepped tool design that is the most complex of the 3 types of pandanus leaf tools. I think it's highly unlikely that a naive crow without any experience of pandanus tools could have invented a multi-step tool, without first making a simpler tool, says Hunt. And yet there's no sign of the more basic designs on pandanus leaves at these sites. The birds don't appear to make earlier, simpler designs, says Hunt, they just seem to go straight to making the most complex design, just as humans go straight to making the latest model and don't recapitulate all the technological stages that enabled them to get to the current design. Circumstantial evidence, to be sure, but we often accept parsimonious explanations in the absence of absolute proof, says Hunt. In his view, the evidence points to cumulative improvement in pandanus tool technology. Christian Rutz argues that there is not yet sufficient evidence to justify these claims, more study is needed. However, the crows do seem to understand how their hooked stick tools work, which hints at how cumulative improvement may have come about. In a suite of experiments on wild-caught New Caledonian crows, Rutz and his colleague James J. H. St. Clair found that the birds paid close attention to which end of a tool is hooked and oriented it correctly. This recognition, they write, has implications for the timescales over which tools may be profitably curated. That is, the birds can reuse a tool even if they don't remember which way they put it down and can also use tools discarded by other birds, which, say the scientists, is potentially a key mechanism for the social learning and diffusion of tool-related information in crow populations. Moreover, the pair argues, the crow's ability to distinguish between the functional features of tools and modify them, make them a little better, may contribute to the evolution of tool complexity. Why is it that out of some 117 species of corvids, the New Caledonian crow became such a wizard with gizmos? What were the forces nudging the crow toward this remarkable faculty? Other crows are smart. Other crows live in tropical locations. Is there something special about this place? This bird? New Caledonia is by all measures a wondrous spot. A remote sprig of land 220 miles long between New Zealand and Papua. From the air, the island looks like it was born of the same fiery forces as other Pacific islands, Hawaii or Bali or nearby Vanuatu, tall green mountains, white beaches, blue lagoons. But unlike most islands dotting these warm seas, New Caledonia is not young and volcanic. It's the geologic offspring of the ancient supercontinent Gondwanaland, the northernmost edge of an almost completely submerged continent, Zealandia, which rifted away from Australia 66 million years ago. It was underwater until its final immersion 37 million years ago. The island is one of the quietest places I've ever been to. It has roughly the land area of New Jersey, but less than 3% of the population, so in many places it feels almost uninhabited. The Kanak, the island's indigenous people, make up more than 2/5 of the population, while the Caldoques, the Europeans, mostly French, make up about 1/3, the rest are a mix of peoples from neighboring islands. The empty roads are frequented by those big swamp hens known as pucos, with bright red bills and violet chests. Tall, slender Cook pines pillar the sky, named for the renowned explorer Captain James Cook. When Cook approached the island, one of the first Europeans to do so, in 1774, he and his crew saw a vast cluster of elevated objects and bet on whether they were trees or stone pillars. The pines belong to a tree family often called living fossils because they look like the ancestral evergreen trees that forested the planet in dinosaur days. Down the center of the island runs a spine of mountains, the eastern slopes patchy green with primeval rainforest. In the gloom below the canopy lives that ghostly kagu, a bird that may be a relict species dating from the days of Gondwanaland. The primeval rainforest that once blanketed New Caledonia has been reduced to pockets. But the island remains a diversity hotspot, with insect species thought to number upward of 20,000, including more than 70 native species of butterflies and 300+ species of moths. There are some 3,200 species of plants on the island, 3/4 of which are endemic, found nowhere else. For this reason, New Caledonia is often considered its own distinct floristic subkingdom. It is also an ark of colossal creatures. The giant gecko, the devil in the trees, for instance, which measures 14 inches, and skinks that reach a hefty 23 inches. One mammoth air-breathing land snail, Placostylus vibratus, grows to a full 5 inches. The Goliath imperial pigeon, known locally as Notu, is the world's largest arboreal pigeon, weighing in at more than 2 pounds, roughly twice the heft of a common rock dove. Gone the way of extinction is the ground-bound swamp hen Porphyrio coquidii, a bird the size of a turkey, and the huge flightless Sylviornis neocaledonii, 5.5 feet long and 66 pounds. Strange things happen on islands. Gigantism is not uncommon. Nor is dwarfism or gaudy experiment or anomalies of every kind. On the island of Borneo, I caught sight of a male Asian paradise flycatcher, a bird no bigger than a robin, but dangling a pair of weirdly elongated central tail feathers, opalescent streamers a foot long that rippled through the vivid green of the rainforest like the tail of a kite. Islands are castles of experiment surrounded by moats. Competition is less fierce and predators less abundant than on continents, so evolutionary experimentation is not so quickly or ruthlessly punished. That includes behavioral experimentation, like tooling around with tools. According to Christian Rutz and his colleagues, the crows probably arrived on the island of New Caledonia sometime after its immersion 37 million years ago. Some fossilized skulls and bones of the crow have been excavated in May or cave in the Moinde region of the island. But these remains are only a few thousand years old, so they're not much help in understanding the bird's deeper evolutionary history. The corvid family split into different lineages tens of millions of years ago, but the ancestral line of New Caledonian crows is probably not that old. It's likely that ancestors of these crows flew large distances over open water to reach New Caledonia, Rutz suggests, probably from Southeast Asia or Australasia. Modern New Caledonian crows are poor flyers, they typically make only short perch-to-perch flights, and when they have to go longer distances, their flight is slow and labored. But Rutz suspects they descended from birds that were either strong flyers or lucky colonists. And most likely, it was after these crows colonized the island that they evolved their extraordinary ability to make and use tools, sometime in the past several million years. For animals clever enough to extract it, New Caledonia offers a concealed cache of rich, juicy prey, grubs of the long-horned beetle and other invertebrates that burrow deep into wood. The grubs are heavy in protein and energy-rich lipids. According to Rutz, a crow can satisfy its entire daily energy requirements with only a few larvae. There's not much competition for these natural energy packets. No woodpeckers or monkeys or apes or aais or striped possums or other so-called extractive specialists that can pull food from holes. Nor are there slews of enemies to threaten the crows from earth or sky. The island does have some aerial predators, the whistling kite, the peregrine falcon, the white-bellied goshawk, but these are not generally considered threats to the crows. New Caledonia has no snakes to speak of and no native predatory mammals. The island's only native mammals are 9 species of bats that play a major role in dispersing the seeds of many rainforest tree species. When Cook arrived on the island, naming it New Caledonia after his beloved Scotland, he brought with him 2 dogs as a present for the Kanak people. Bad idea. Now feral dogs abound, along with other introduced species, such as cats and rats. The dogs have decimated the Kagu population, but they pose little danger to the crows. One consequence of such modest threat from competitors and predators is that the crows are free from the burden of vigilance. In other words, they have the time and ease of mind to tinker with sticks and barbed leaves, to poke and probe, to bite and tear, and then probe again, without looking up. Freedom from threats may also have allowed for the evolution of a more leisurely childhood, in which young crows under the watch of their parents could dabble safely in toolmaking, refining their skills over a long period of time without starving in the process. Baby crows don't jump out of the nest able to make perfect tools. Some evidence suggests that they're genetically predisposed to use them, as woodpecker finches are. One experiment showed that young crows in captivity learn to make and use basic stick tools on their own, without exposure to adults. But when it comes to making more complex tools, young birds clearly benefit from adult tutoring or modeling. They make full-fledged pandanus tools, for instance, only after spending time with an adult. The learning process tends to be a school of hard knocks, softened by the presence of a doting parent or parents. As a PhD student studying with Russell Gray and Gavin Hunt at the University of Auckland, Jenny Holzhader spent 2 years in the rainforests of New Caledonia observing how young crows learn to make and use pandanus tools in the wild. Watching the videotapes she and Gray made of a bird named Yellow Yellow is a little like watching a toddler learning how to eat with a spoon, without spilling his food. It's a slow process, full of mishaps and lost opportunities. In his lecture on the evolution of cognition, Gray describes the young bird's progress. At the start, Yellow Yellow has no clue what he's doing. By the age of 2 or 3 months, he's paying close attention to the actions of his mother, Pandora. He sees her fish with her tool. Then he borrows the tool and tries to wedge it down a hole sideways. He seems to get what the tool is for but not how to use it. By using her tools and following her around, He's learning what sorts of plants and sticks make good fishing implements and roughly what tools are good for. Once he starts trying to make his own tools, he doesn't mimic his mother's movements. Rather, he emulates the tools she makes, attempting his own approximate copies. This may help to explain the existence of regional styles of toolmaking. By observing and using tools made by their parents, juvenile crows may form a kind of mental template of the locally produced tool design and use this as a basis for their own tool manufacture, explains Gray. We know that in birdsong, there's a form of template matching where through trial and error learning, the juveniles match the adult song. Maybe the same kind of neural circuits are being co-opted for template matching in toolmaking. The rest of the process appears to be mostly a matter of experimentation. Over the next months, the young bird tries his hand at ripping up pandanus leaves, willy-nilly. The bits and pieces he tears off seem random, but at least he's getting the hang of the tearing technique. At 5 months, he's capable of making something that looks like a tool. But he often uses the wrong part of the pandanus leaf, the part with no barbs, so the tool is useless. He flips it around and tries using it that way, but no go. A few months later, he's got the manufacturing sequence down and is executing all the right moves, cutting the pandanus leaves in the proper area, ripping away pieces step by step, all very carefully. But because he started in the wrong spot, the tool is upside down, with barbs facing in the wrong direction. Half the tool's yellow mix won't bring him any food. It's almost a year and a half before he's practiced at making adult-like pandanus tools that allow him to feed himself effectively. That's a long stint of schooling. It works only because his parents support his education by letting him tag along and use their tools, and when he fails at feeding himself, they pop a fat grub or two in his beak to tide him over. The island does its part by allowing him to spend long hours of his young life honing his skills, moving gradually from bumbling apprentice to amateur tinkerer to expert toolmaker without interruption from, say, death. In this respect, New Caledonian crows may offer clues to understanding our own human strategies of life. We humans stand out in our primate tribe for the extended period of juvenile dependence we enjoy, and our learning-intensive survival strategies. According to the Auckland team, the link between a high level of technological skill in foraging and a long juvenile period of provisioning by parents, in both humans and New Caledonian crows suggests that the two traits may be causally related. It's called the early learning hypothesis. Perhaps possessing learning-intensive tool skills plays a role in lengthening the juvenile period. In this way, New Caledonian crows may provide a good model for investigating the evolutionary effect of tool use on life history, not just for birds but for people. A hidden trove of rich food, scarce competition, and a paucity of predators may have created conditions favoring tool crafting, but as Christian Rutz points out, these factors alone are not sufficient to produce it. Lots of crows in the Pacific region with similar lifestyles and access to pandanus leaves don't make tools. In northeast Australia dwells the Torresian crow, a cousin of the New Caledonian crow. It lives among the larvae of the Australian longicorn beetle and has no competition for this super-rich food source, but it hasn't figured out how to tap it with tools. Nor is the white-billed crow of the Solomon Islands, perhaps the New Caledonian crow's closest relative, a tool user. Is there something special in the physical or mental makeup of the New Caledonian crow? Something in its body or brain that distinguishes it from its corvid colleagues? I first met the bird early one morning when I stepped out of my lodge in La Foa, in central New Caledonia. There it is, a few feet in front of me, in the low branches of a scrabbly tree. In a way, I'm delighted to see that it doesn't differ so much from the American crows that haunt my neighborhood. Ebony of beak, legs, and feathers. Upper feathers glossy, iridescent purple, deep blue, or green, depending on the light. Body about the size of a smallish crow, though a bit more compact than our American crows and beefier than your average jay or jackdaw. The bird cocks its head at me. Its eyes are large and prominent, dark brown, beady, intelligent. They are also positioned more toward the front of the head, capable of rotating around and orienting forward during tool use to create a kind of extraordinary binocular overlap greater than that of any other bird. This wide, binocular visual field allows the crow to position its bill accurately when probing with a tool. New research by Alex Kaselnik of Oxford University and his colleagues suggests another visual twist. In crows, as in humans, one eye is more dominant than the other. Crows hold their tools on one side of the bill or the other so they can see the tip of the tool and their target with their preferred eye. As Kaselnik puts it, if you were holding a brush in your mouth and one of your eyes better than the other at brush length, you would hold the brush so that its tip fell in view of the better eye. This is what crows do. The bird's bill, for its part, is straight, conical, and businesslike, free of fancy hooks or curves that mark other corvid beaks, the better to firmly grip a tool and bring its tip into range of that powerful binocular field. A beak is the one appendage birds have for investigating the edible world. Ordinarily, its shape seriously limits what a bird can eat. Hawks and eagles have hooked beaks for ripping into rabbits. Herons have tongue-like bills for snapping up slippery fish. Woodpeckers have sharp pick-like beaks for chipping away at wood. Some crows have hooks, others have pincers, still others have spears. On its own, the bill of the New Caledonian crow can do only so much. But this crow has figured out how to expand its reach through the miracle of tools. It's not clear which came first, toolmaking or the unusual physical adaptations so neatly adapted to its requirements. Did the crow's bill shape and specialized vision predispose them to tool crafting and use? Or did their tool use behavior in response to unusual ecological opportunity, those delicious hidden grubs, gradually shape their visual system and bills? This is the sort of mysterious causal relationship biologists both love and hate. In any case, say scientists, these two features, specialized visual system and straight, conical bill, allow for a level of tool control impossible for other corvids and are akin to the features that enabled our own skillful tool handling, including binocular vision and flexible wrists and opposable thumbs, which allow us to grip and pinch with precision. As Gavin Hunt points out, several other aspects of the New Caledonian crow's toolmaking lifestyle also resemble our own. There's the extraordinarily long extended juvenile period with parental care, which scaffolds the learning of toolmaking and tool use. Moreover, says Hunt, in both humans and crows, tool use is both genetically inherited and flexible, and thus widespread if not universal. The occurrence of tool use appears to be patchy across both species. Thus the transmission process, even if it involves less social learning in New Caledonian crows than in humans, produces a very similar result. The crow stares back at me, intense, quizzical, as if asking what is so surprising. I wonder if the brain inside that black skullcap is any different from the brain of other corvids. Research suggests that there may be small differences. One study shows that the New Caledonian crow's brain is bigger, at least compared with the brains of carrion crows and European magpies and jays. There is some ballooning in areas of the forebrain thought to be involved in fine motor control and in associative learning. This may improve the crow's dexterity and boost its ability to pay attention to what it's doing, a big advantage in any mental challenge. Moreover, as Russell Gray points out, New Caledonian crow brains have slightly higher numbers of glial cells, which in humans are thought to be involved in the mechanism of learning and memory known as synaptic plasticity. In sum, the brains of these crows may possess no miraculous extra new structure, observes Gray, just small, incremental tweaks. But are these crows capable of high-level thinking? Can they understand physical principles such as cause and effect? Do they reason and plan and make leaps of insight? For the past decade or so, the University of Auckland team and their colleagues have been probing the crow's mind, poking around its nooks and crannies to see what kind of special understanding, if any, these birds may possess. They're less interested in trumpeting the crow's overall intelligence than in exploring what they call the signature, cognitive mechanisms at play when the bird solves problems. These may be the building blocks or foundations of such sophisticated human cognitive abilities as insight and reasoning, imagining and planning. They include skills such as the ability to notice the consequences of one's own actions, to grasp cause and effect, and to assess the physical characteristics of materials. When these birds are problem-solving, they may be using forms of cognition intermediate between simple learning and human thought, explains Taylor. The signatures of cognition evident in the crow's behavior might represent the in-between steps along the way to our own complex cognitive abilities such as imagining scenarios or reasoning about cause and effect. That's why we're really interested in these crows as model species, says Taylor. Pinpointing the cognitive mechanisms they use can offer insights into the evolution of human thinking and of intelligence in general. Consider what 007 did in that video of the 8-stage metatool puzzle. It looked like the clever crow solved the problem with insight. He seemed to study the whole problem. There's food in that box I can't reach with my beak, and then, by playing out a complex mental scenario in his head, to solve the problem in a flash of understanding, planning his sequence of moves and executing them one at a time, keeping his ultimate goal always in mind. According to Russell Gray, who conducted the original metatool experiments with Taylor, what 007 did was probably less sensational than this, though still intriguing. The bird did indeed scope out the problem, says Gray. But he probably wasn't using his imagination or building scenarios in the way that we do, or solving the problem in a flash of insight. Instead, he was acting on objects that were physically present and familiar to him. He knew how they worked. He paid close attention to how his tools interacted with the other objects. Drawing on his past experience with the objects, he followed an appropriate sequence of actions that led to his goal. If he was using mental scenario building at all, suggests Gray, it was of a highly limited kind, dependent on context and experience. The actions of 007 could be either more sophisticated than this or even simpler, notes Alex Taylor. A type of moment-to-moment decision-making, with no mental simulation at all, he says. We just don't know. These are competing hypotheses we need to test. The aviary where the University of Auckland conducts its mind-probing experiments sits in a scrubby field, behind a small research station in Fokolo. In the wet season, a creek meanders through the property, subject to extreme flooding during storms. Its bed is dry now, shaded by Shambly melaleuca trees and the occasional pandanus. Except for the low, husky YNG of the 7 crows currently occupying the netted enclosures, the scene is quiet. Horses wander through the field, once in a while setting off raucous crow alarm calls when they come too close. A stream of well-studied crows have flowed through this aviary, among them 007 and now Blue, named for the blue band he wears on his left leg. The Auckland team keeps the birds in the aviary for a few months before releasing them back into the wild. The colored bands help them to keep track of which bird is which, and offer a stand-in for a name until imagination kicks in with something more inventive. After christening more than 150 birds, Alex Taylor says he has exhausted his supply and asks for suggestions. So Blue's daughters, Red and Green, are now named after my daughters, Zoe and Nell. The scientists capture the crows using a owushed net and try to collect them in family groups. In places with high-density populations of the birds, this is fairly straightforward. But in many spots on the island, especially in higher elevation forests, the birds are more sparsely distributed and may be particularly difficult to catch. Taylor's colleague Gavin Hunt recently had a devil of a time collecting birds in the Mount Pani area. It was the official Kanak hunting season of the Notu. New Caledonian crows occasionally end up in the line of fire aimed at the pigeons, so the crows are more skittish than usual during this season. Hunt came away empty-handed. Even without the disruption of gunshots, the process takes patience. Once the captured crows are brought to the aviary, they quickly adjust to their new digs. And who wouldn't? Taylor and his colleague Elsa Lois-Sell feed them fresh ripe tomatoes, cubes of beef, papaya, coconut, eggs. Before long, the birds settle in and come whizzing down to the table for work. The trick is keeping them amused, says Taylor, keeping the rhythm going of making their tasks just hard enough for them to stay interested and engaged. What we really want to understand is how these crows think, says Taylor. How do they solve complex problems? Through insight or reasoning or something more mundane? Think back to the string pulling task that was part of 007's 8-step challenge. The crow's remarkable ability to spontaneously pull up a stick attached to a string hanging from a perch has been viewed by some scientists as proof of insight. The bird creates a mental simulation of the problem and then instantly executes a plan to solve it. To see whether this is so, Taylor and his colleagues set up a variation of the experiment using a string with meat attached for reward. In their version, the crows couldn't see the meat moving toward them when they pulled the string. This stymied the birds. Without the visual reinforcement of the meat moving closer and closer, cueing them to keep up the activity, only one crow out of 11 spontaneously pulled the string a sufficient number of times to get the meat. Their performance stooped to canine cluelessness. When the birds were given a mirror in which to watch their progress, they once again excelled at solving the problem. If this had been an example of insight, of a sudden, instantaneous understanding of cause and effect, pull on string and meat will move closer, the birds wouldn't have needed visual feedback to continuously direct their actions. Whether New Caledonian crows have leaps of insight remains to be determined, but these experiments suggest that these birds do have an extraordinary ability to notice the consequences of their own actions, says Taylor, and to pay attention to the way objects interact. These are mighty useful mental tools when it comes to making and using material tools. The Auckland team is also attempting to figure out whether the crows understand basic physical principles. A crow-appropriate paradigm for this, as Taylor puts it, is an experimental version of the old Aesop's fable, The Crow and the Pitcher. In that fable, a thirsty crow comes across a half-filled jug of water. Unable to reach the water to drink, the crow drops pebble after pebble into the pitcher until the water level rises enough for him to drink. As it turns out, this is not just a folktale. New Caledonian crows will do exactly that, drop stones into a water-filled tube to raise the water level. And, as Sarah Gelbert discovered while working with the Auckland team, if given a choice between heavy objects and light ones, solid and hollow ones, the crows will spontaneously pick objects that will sink over those that will float. They know how to pick their materials and will select the right option 90% of the time. This suggests that the crows understand water displacement, a fairly sophisticated physical concept, on par with the comprehension of a child 5 to 7 years old. It also suggests that they're able to grasp the basic physical properties of objects and make inferences about them. Lately, Taylor and Gray and their colleagues have been trying to worm out whether the birds understand the relationship between cause and effect, especially the effect of forces they can't see. This is called causal reasoning, and it's one of our most powerful mental abilities. Causal reasoning is at the root of our understanding that objects in the world behave in predictable ways and that mechanisms, or forces we can't see, may be responsible for events. We're constantly making inferences about things we can't see, says Gray. If we're standing inside and a frisbee flies through our window, we understand that someone must have thrown it. The human ability to reason about causal agents develops very early in life. An infant only 7 to 10 months old shows surprise if a beanbag is thrown from behind a screen and then the screen is lifted to reveal a toy block, rather than an expected human causal agent such as a hand. As Gray points out, this ability underlies our grasp of thunder and head colds, magnets and tides, gravity and gods. It also helps us to understand the behavior of people around us and allows us to make and use tools and adapt them to novel situations. It's another one of those potent capacities once thought unique to humans. Can crows make similar inferences about forces they can't see, so-called hidden causal agents? The idea for an experiment to test this notion was actually suggested to Alex Taylor by a crow. Scientists who study bird behavior live chancier lives than many of their colleagues, at risk of being foiled by the creatures they're studying, or, with any luck, instructed by them. Birds can undo the cleverest devices, taking the stuffing out of a scientist about as fast as anything you can imagine. But there are other moments, if one is paying attention, that may offer a rich reward. In this case, the surprising behavior of a crow named Laura offered inspiration for Taylor. It was during an early stage in the Aesop's experimental trial. Taylor baited a floating cork with food, then dropped the cork into a tube of water. He always performed this task with his back turned to the crows. The typical scenario that followed was this: once the birds solved the puzzle, raising the water level to get at the treat, they immediately flew up to a perch at the back of the cage, ripped the meat off the cork to eat it, and then dropped the cork. To rebate the cork, Taylor had to retrieve it from the rear of the cage. Which is fine for one trial, he says. But after 100 trials, you're fairly sick of that. The task of retrieval is made all the more difficult because the aviary is set up to suit the crows, nice wide table, plenty of perches, says Taylor. So it becomes kind of a jungle, impossible for a human to move through. You end up crawling on your hands and knees a lot. Laura did things differently. Like the other birds, she took off with the baited cork, but once she had eaten the meat, she would fly back to the table and leave the cork there, very close to where Taylor was standing. I was like, oh, thank you so much. That is so awesome. Not only was he grateful that he didn't have to crawl under the table to retrieve the cork, but he could rebate it quickly, speeding up the pace of the experiment. This made Taylor think. Maybe Laura had figured out his role as the causal agent responsible for the food offering, even though she had never actually seen him bait the cork. I thought, maybe she understands that if she gets the cork back to me, she gets the food more quickly. She's really good at this task, I'm the limiting factor. So if she can speed me up, she speeds up her treats. Laura's behavior made Taylor wonder if New Caledonian crows might have a more sophisticated grasp of causal reasoning than we imagined. Do they understand that humans can act as causal agents even when their actions are hidden? Can they reason about unobservable causal mechanisms? To find out, he and his colleagues devised an inventive experiment. The idea was to figure out whether the crows could infer that the movement of a stick poking in and out of a hide was caused by a person they had seen entering the hide. In an open aviary, the team set up a hide behind a tarp. On a table next to the hide sat a small box holding food that could be extracted by a crow with a simple tool. To get at the food, the crows had to turn their backs to the tarp hide. In the tarp was a hole. When a stick was thrust through the hole from behind the hide, it poked directly into the space where the crow's head would be when it was probing for food in the box, posing a clear danger. For the experiment, 8 crows watched 2 different scenarios in which the stick poked through the hole, explains Taylor. The first scenario was the hidden causalagent situation. A human entered the hide, the stick moved in and out of the hole several times, and then the human left the hide. In the second scenario, no human entered or exited the hide, but the stick still poked in and out. After observing each scenario, the crows were given the chance to probe for food in the box. Their behavior suggested that they were able to connect the dots and infer that the hidden human was causing the stick's movement. When the birds watched the stick move and then saw the human leave the hide, they appeared comfortable flying down to the table and turning their backs to the hide so they could probe for food. However, when they watched the stick move with no apparent cause, they behaved more skittishly, flying to the table, but inspecting the hide nervously and sometimes abandoning their probing, as if they suspected that whatever unknown force had moved the stick might make it move again. The difference in the crow's behavior, say the scientists, suggests that the birds may be capable of a fairly sophisticated form of causal reasoning. In another experiment, this one on causal intervention, the crows didn't fare so well. Causal intervention is a step beyond causal understanding. It involves seeing something transpire in the world and then acting to create the same effect. Say, for example, you've never shaken a fruit tree to release the fruit. But one day, you see the wind blowing a branch, causing the fruit to fall. And from that observation, you infer that if you shake the branch, you can act like the wind and make the fruit fall. A gadget called a Blicket box offers just this sort of challenge. It's a little box that plays music when you put an object on top of it. Give a 2-year-old child a quick demonstration of this, then give her the box and the object and ask, "Can you make it go?" And she will have no trouble recreating the effect. But crows fail at the task. All they have to do is pick up the object and pop it on the box, says Taylor. It sounds so simple to human minds. It's like, duh, how hard could that be, right? But the crows don't get it. Taylor finds these crow failures as intriguing as their successes. If you're interested in the evolution of cognitive mechanisms, it's equally interesting to see where birds fail, he explains. We're trying to understand which parts of causal understanding may have evolved together and which did not, he says. I'm not out to cheerlead these crows. I just want to know how their minds work. If they end up being as stupid in some areas and smart in other areas, if they can't do some things but can do others, that's just as interesting. The cool thing about them is their wild behavior and their tool use. That's what defines them. Taylor admits to interest in another line of inquiry. Less academic, perhaps, but no less intriguing. What do New Caledonian crows do for fun? My impression is that they're kind of workaholics, he says. They're very focused on getting food, but once they've got the food, they just chill out, sit and do a bit of preening, a bit of flying, a bit of calling. But they're not constantly playing with new things, like Kias do. I find that fascinating because everyone always says, curiosity and play are linked with intelligence. Do birds play? Do they do things just for fun? Nathan Emery, senior lecturer in animal intelligence at Queen Mary, University of London, and Nicola Clayton of the University of Cambridge suggest that larger-brained, altricial species of birds do play, although it seems to be relatively uncommon in birds, they write. Seen in only 1% of the approximately 10,000 species and largely restricted to species with an extended play is not necessarily only about preparing a bird for later life, say Emery and Clayton. It may reduce stress, aid social bonding, or just induce pleasure. Birds, like us, may also play because it is fun, they explain. It produces a pleasurable experience, releasing endogenous opioids. That is, play can be its own consummatory act, self-rewarding. According to zoologist Millicent Ficken, it's only clever birds that are capable of complex play activities. And through play, they make discoveries and experiment with the relationship between their own actions and the external world. In other words, play both requires intelligence and nurtures it. Members of the parrot family tend to be an irrepressibly playful lot. When my parents bought a pet parakeet for our family many decades ago, they also purchased a menagerie of toys to outfit his cage. Ladders, mirrors, bells, all made of brightly colored cheap plastic, as well as several strangely shaped food treats. It was standard procedure at the time. Gre, as we called him, played with every new device until it broke from overuse. These days, pet stores sell whole lines of special parrot toys. African gray parrots prefer playthings like toilet paper rolls, junk mail, popsicle sticks, paper cups, and plastic pen tops. Anything made of paper, cardboard, wood, and rawhide that they can shred, chew, or otherwise destroy. Sometimes they get so lost in their fun, they fall off their perches. According to expert testimony, the kings of foul play are Kias. These crow-sized parrots live in the southern Alps of New Zealand. They're nicknamed mountain monkeys because of their cheeky nature and primate-like intelligence. On the derivation of their Latin name, Nestor Notabilis, one book offers this account. Nestor was a legendary Greek hero known for long life and wisdom, and the name is often used to mean a wise counselor, a leader. Then the Killjoy comment, Linnaeus bestowed the name on this parrot family, probably without thought of any special significance. Maybe. Maybe not. Two scientists, Judy Diamond and Alan Bond, who have studied the Kia for many years, consider it possibly the smartest, most waggish bird in the world. Play in Kias is less a set of ritualized behaviors than an attitude to the world at large, they write. When it comes to playing with stuff, Kias far outshine their corvid cousins. They are bold, curious, and ingeniously destructive, says Diamond, considered either playful comics, clowns of the mountains, or destructive hoodlums that go around in juvenile gangs trashing things, deconstructing windshield wipers and the vinyl trim on cars, as well as campers' tents and backpacks, rain gutters, and outdoor furniture. The Kia's playfulness with objects may help them develop a toolkit of behaviors for dealing with novel situations or unexpected foraging problems. Kias also love to horseplay. An invitation to another bird occurs in the form of a cock of the head and a kind of stiff-legged sidling up to a potential play partner. The partners parry and duel with their beaks, ducking, thrusting, ducking again. They tussle, lock bills, bite, push with their feet, roll on their backs while squealing and waving their feet, and stand on each other's stomachs. There are no winners or losers. Sometimes Kias play the imp or practical jokester. According to Diamond and Bond, the birds have been known to steal television antennae from houses and deflate automobile tires. One Kia was observed rolling up a doormat and pushing it down a flight of steps. A few years ago, the New Zealand Sunday Morning Herald reported that a Kia stole $1,100 from an unsuspecting Scottish tourist at a rest area near the highest pass over the Southern Alps. Peter Leach had rolled down the windows of his camper van to snap pictures of the views and an odd green bird on the ground near his vehicle. Before he knew it, the bird had fluttered into his van. It snatched a small cloth bag from his dashboard and zipped off with it. It took all the money I had, Leach said with chagrin. The birds are now lining their nests with 50-pound notes. Kias may be the titans of tomfoolery, but corvids frolic, too. Ravens play toss with themselves, throwing twigs up in the air and catching them. 2 young white-necked ravens were once observed playing king of the castle, one standing on a mound brandishing a lump of dung while the other charged up and tried to seize the object. One clear sunny February morning in the central mountains of Hokkaido, Japan, naturalist Mark Brazil noticed 2 ravens on a steep slope of fresh powdery snow. One of the ravens lay on its breast and slid down the slope, its partner rolled, legs in the air, wings flicking. The pair continued this sledging and rolling downhill for more than 10 meters before flying back upslope, wrote Brazil, then repeated the hot dogging. Crows, too, have been known to slide down slopes, apparently for fun. Carrion crows were caught on camera in Japan skidding down a children's slide. Not long ago, a video from Russia of a crow snowboarding down a roof with a jar lid went viral. Alice Auersperg and an international team of scientists recently took a close look at how various species of crows and parrots play with toy objects to see if the nature of their play might shed light on the cognitive nature of the players, as well as the relationship between play and tool use. Playing with objects often precedes using them as tools in primates as well as in birds. A survey of 74 primate species found that only tool users, like capuchin monkeys and great apes, combine objects when they play. Children start smashing objects together when they're 8 months old. By 10 months, they can insert toys into cavities or stack rings on a pole. But it's only after the age of 2 or so that they begin using objects as tools to achieve a desired goal. The researchers gave 9 species of parrots and 3 species of crows the same sets of wooden toddler toys of various shapes and colors. They also gave them an activity plate, a kind of playground of tubes and holes for inserting the objects or stacking the rings. Most of the birds interacted with the toys, but a few were champion players. New Caledonian crows, cockatoos, and kias were most apt to combine 2 free toys and to use toys on the playground. The most complex object play, say the researchers, occurred in species with the highest performance in technical innovation and tool use. Goffins cockatoos and New Caledonian crows. The Goffins favored yellow toys. The New Caledonian crows, for no apparent reason, preferred balls above all other objects. But they did like to poke sticks into the cavities on the playground. Only Goffins and young New Caledonian crows combined 3 free objects, and only parrots stacked rings onto tubes and poles, the Goffins more than any other, neatly coordinating their beak with 1 foot to accomplish the task. These Indonesian birds are known for their outstanding problem-solving skills and for using tools creatively in captivity. Our studies show a link between object play and functional behavior in these large-brained birds, says Auersperg. But the direct role that play behavior plays in their problem-solving abilities remains unclear. It might serve as general motor skill practice or learning about object affordances, the relationship between the object and the bird or the object and its environment, which affords the bird an opportunity to perform an action. Or, she says, it could just be a side product of. Interesting to note, all the birds seemed happy to share while they played. No bird hogged more than 1 activity plate or more than 2 or 3 toys at once. There were no overt cases of aggression and monopolization of objects was not pronounced, say the researchers. Taylor observes that New Caledonian crows in his aviaries don't seem to play for play's sake. They like having things in their beaks, bits and bobs, he says. If you put tools in the cage, they'll spend a lot of time caching the stick, picking it up, probing into things with it. But it's hard to call that play, because in the wild, that's how they make their living. Recently, Taylor was interested in finding out whether New Caledonian crows might be motivated by a little spontaneous, self-rewarding fun instead of food. His lure, a pair of tiny skateboards to see if these crows, like their Japanese and Russian cousins, might enjoy sliding. Unfortunately, the experiment didn't pan out. They really didn't like sliding, says Taylor, so we rather gave up on this. One serious question the Auckland team and other scientists would like to tease from the crow's mind is this: which came first, tool use or these impressive cognitive abilities? Did using tools make these birds smarter? Or were they super smart to begin with? And their cognitive abilities provided a kind of a platform or mental toolkit for figuring out how to use tools. It's possible that life on the island fostered intelligence in these birds, as it may have for the woodpecker finches of the Galapagos. A relatively unpredictable environment may have created evolutionary pressure to evolve sophisticated cognitive abilities for coping with its challenges. These adaptations, in turn, may have provided a foundation for the evolution of tool use. On the other hand, tool use itself may have driven the evolution of sophisticated cognitive abilities. Maybe the crows chanced on the use of a stick tool to extract food. This exposed them to new sorts of mental challenges that stimulated their ability to solve physical problems. The tool users had a selective advantage because they could get at these fabulously rich grubs. Once the technique spread, natural selection may have favored the evolution of traits such as extreme binocular vision, which improved its efficiency. According to Alex Taylor, this chicken and egg question is a holy grail for New Caledonian crow researchers. If it's the case that sophisticated tools affect intelligence, then the populations that have a history of making more sophisticated tools would be smarter. And that would provide evidence for the technical intelligence hypothesis. Of course, as Gavin Hunt points out, the birds had to have some mental sophistication to put two and two together to come up with the idea of using a tool. Still, I'm not sure whether New Caledonian crows would have been cleverer than other crow species initially, Hunt says. But once they initiated tool use, that drove the enhancement of their cognitive skills to the level we see today, which is quite impressive. So perhaps tool use is not unlike play, it both requires intelligence and nurtures it. The bird dubbed 007 came from the forest of Mount Kogi, where the crows make sophisticated hook tools. Was he exceptional in any way? In terms of his boldness and willingness to persevere, yes, says Taylor. He was a young bird from a family of 3, all pretty keen on the ball. One researcher who worked with 007 would simply point at him, and the bird took this as his signal to come down for a work session. Sometimes Taylor would find 007 queuing up at the door to his aviary, keen on getting started with his work. I'd have to say to him, "So sorry you have to wait, I'm testing the dumb birds down the corridor." But Taylor finds the variation between individual crows less interesting than the differences between populations of crows from different parts of the island, how they vary in their tool use and cognitive abilities. Next up for the University of Auckland investigators, joining an ambitious international effort to explore the genetic basis of the New Caledonian crow's intelligence as a whole, and the differences between populations. One approach involves comparing the genomes of New Caledonian crows and other closely related species. The plan is to identify genes that may have been selected for in the New Caledonian crow lineage but not in closely related species, and then to see how those might be linked to differences in cognitive abilities. Another approach, now underway in the Auckland Aviary, is looking within the New Caledonian crow population for variations in cognitive abilities and genes. A bird like 007, for instance, who comes from the Mount Kogi population of crows that make hook tools, may carry variants of genes that differ from the genes of Blue, who comes from the basic stick tool-making population of La Foa, in central New Caledonia. Do crows from different parts of the island, with different types of tool manufacture, differ in their cognitive abilities? And do these differences correlate with genetic variations? My last day in New Caledonia, I drive up a narrow switchback road to the top of Mount Kogi, 007's birthplace. The primeval rainforest that cloaks Kogi's slopes is known as the home of Goliaths, Leach's giant gecko and the towering Kogi kauri, a tree of massive girth, as much as 8 feet across, that pierces the canopy at 60 or 70 feet. According to Taylor, 007 probably has his own family by now. I'm hoping to catch a glimpse of the Kogi crows, but the day is waning. I'm used to the slow, ruddy burnishing of dusk. Here at the equator, the day clangs shut in sudden finality, especially in the dim pitch of the rainforest. Suddenly, the woods are spooky. Every forest has its own character, its own whispered rumors and smells. The primeval mountain forests of New Caledonia hold echoes of early plants, early birds. In the moist, shaded understory grows the evergreen shrub Ambarella, the nearest relative to the world's first flowering plants. Huge primeval tree ferns from the Cyatheaceae family, like those that grew in the Permian period 275 million years ago, reach heights of 65 feet, with fronds up to 10 feet long, among the largest leaves in the plant kingdom. In Kanak languages, the name of the tree fern means the beginning of the country of men. Creation stories tell of the first human ancestor climbing out of a hollow tree fern trunk. Time seems to move in a different dimension here. Hurry drifts into the radiant greens. The mind is quieted by wonder. Walking along, peering up into the thick canopy, my binoculars trained on